She had chosen the name carefully. Not so plain as to invite suspicion, not so fine as to draw the wrong kind of attention. Maud, she had decided. Maud Selby. The kind of name that sat quietly in a room and was not remembered afterward. She had practiced it for 3 days at the inn in Inverness, writing it in the steam on the window glass each morning, until her hand formed the letters without thinking, until she could answer to it without a half-second's hesitation. That half-second, she knew, was the thing that would undo her. The coaching road to Ashveil had been rough, and the October air had come through the door of the carriage, with all the manners of someone who had not been invited. She had sat with her traveling bag on her lap and watched the Highland hills go gray and then darker gray as the afternoon flattened itself against the horizon. She had not slept. She had not intended to sleep. There was too much to hold in her mind, too many details that had to stay exactly in their places. Ashveil Manor sat at the end of a long drive, lined with larches that had gone the color of rust. She saw it through the carriage window first as a shape, then as a weight, that particular weight old stone has when it has been standing in the same place for 200 years and intends to stand for 200 more. She had not seen it in 4 years. She had not been permitted to see it in 4 years. She permitted herself exactly 3 seconds of feeling something she could not name. Then she tucked it away. The housekeeper who met her at the servants' entrance was a small, precise woman named Mrs. Overton, who looked at her the way one looks at a new pair of boots, noting whether they might prove serviceable before committing to an opinion. "Selby," the woman said, consulting a paper, "you've references from the Delmarsh household in Edinburgh." "Yes, ma'am. Lady Delmarsh writes you are capable and discreet." "I hope so, ma'am." Mrs. Overton looked at her over the edge of the paper. "We don't have much occasion for hope here, Selby. We have occasion for punctuality and correct behavior. The rest manages itself." Maud. She was Maud, she reminded herself. She was entirely and only Maud. Folded her hands and said that she understood. She was shown to a room on the uppermost floor, barely wide enough to turn around in, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her hands in her lap and thought, "I am in my own house. I am in my own house, and I am sleeping in the servants' quarters, and this is entirely my own doing, and it will be worth it." She believed this. She had to believe this. The Duke of Ashveil, she had been told, was not an unkind man. This information had come from her solicitor in Edinburgh, Mr. Fenn, who had provided it in the careful, hedged way that solicitors provide all information that might later be held against them. He was, Mr. Fenn had said, regarded as fair, methodical, a man who managed his affairs with considerable competence, which was why the question of the estate's trusteeship had been extended beyond the initial 2 years. What Mr. Fenn had not told her, what she had been forced to discover through her own inquiries, through a letter to her father's former steward in Aberdeen, through a conversation with a woman who had once worked in the Ashveil kitchens, and now kept a small shop in Inverness, was that the extension of the trusteeship had not been his doing. It had been her uncle's. Her uncle, who had found himself appointed co-trustee by a clause in her father's will that everyone had overlooked, or perhaps not overlooked, but chosen to observe with great strategic patience. She had not overlooked it. She had spent 4 years not overlooking it. Her father had died when she was 20. He had left Ashveil and its grounds to her outright, to Theodora Elliston, his own lay child, with the provision that a trustee manage the estate's affairs until she was of age and circumstances permitted. At 20, she had thought this a reasonable precaution, a formality, the kind of thing fathers did when they wished to be responsible. She was 24 now, and she understood what her father had not, that a formality, in the hands of the wrong person, is simply an opportunity that has been dressed up and made respectable. Her uncle, Mr. Gerald Elliston had presented himself to the courts as a concerned relation. He had suggested, gently, regretfully, with the particular regret of someone who very much wishes to be seen to be reluctant, that his niece was young, inexperienced, and had formed a most unsuitable attachment to a man the family could not sanction. He had suggested that the trusteeship be extended until the question of her future could be determined with more certainty. The attachment had ended. The man had married someone else. She did not permit herself to think of that. What she thought of instead was the clause in the trusteeship agreement that allowed the trustee to designate a residence for his ward, and the way her uncle had used this clause to keep her in a rented house in Edinburgh that smelled of damp and other people's cooking, while Ashveil had quietly, methodically become part of someone else's life. The Duke of Ashveil, Calder Ravane, 5th Duke, 31 years old, was not her uncle's creature. She had been careful to ascertain that. He had entered the arrangement through his own solicitor, at arm's length as the law required. He managed the estate, paid the accounts, submitted his reports to the court. He did not know her. He did not know that the house he had been managing for the past 18 months had ever had an owner young enough to ride its hills, or know the name of every dog in its kennels. He did not know she was here. This was, she had decided, an advantage. She met him on the 3rd morning. She had been given the task of laying the fires in the library and the east drawing room before 7 o'clock, which suited her very well, as the library was the room she needed most to see. She had been looking for something specific, a copy of the original estate ledger from before her father died, which she suspected her uncle had caused to be misplaced rather than destroyed, and she had known she would not be able to find it without access to the shelves. She was on her knees in front of the library grate, her hands black with ash, when she heard the door. She did not turn immediately. That was the first rule of invisibility. Do not react as if you matter. "You're new," said a voice behind her. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, without turning. She reached for another piece of coal. "Mrs. Overton said we were taking on 2 new girls this season. She didn't say when." "I arrived. Monday, Your Grace." A silence. She was aware of him crossing the room, of the sound of books being moved on the table to her left. She kept her eyes on the grate. "There are mud marks on the hearth," he said. "From yesterday." "Yes, Your Grace." "I'll see to them." "They're from my boots," he said. "I came through the garden." She did not say anything to that, because there was nothing to say that Maud Selby would say. "I'll leave them outside my dressing room," he said. "If you have a moment this morning." She understood what was being asked. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with the precise calculation of what she was willing to endure and for how long. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. She cleaned his boots. She cleaned them thoroughly, methodically, in the cold passage outside his dressing room, with a brush that was too stiff and a tin of blacking that was nearly finished. She thought about the ledger. She thought about Mr. Fenn's last letter. She thought about the fact that this was her house, that the man whose boots she was cleaning was living in it, on the strength of a legal arrangement that another 16 months would see dissolved, provided she could demonstrate to the court that she was a competent and capable person of settled circumstances, who could manage her own affairs. She thought about how, exactly, a woman was supposed to demonstrate settled circumstances when she had been denied the estate that constituted most of her income and had no other means of establishing herself except through a marriage she had no intention of making. She set the boots down outside the door, very precisely, heels together. Then she went back to the library and resumed her search. She found what she was not looking for first, as is generally the way. In the 3rd drawer of the writing table, a drawer that had been, as far as she could tell, entirely ignored by whoever had catalogued the library's contents for the estate inventory. She found a bundle of letters, Not her father's letters, her mother's. Her mother had died when Theodora was 11. She had no very clear memory of her, which was one of the sorrows she had learned to carry at a distance, the way one carries something that might break if held too closely. But she recognized the handwriting. She had seen it once on the inside cover of a book that had come to her from her mother's room after the funeral. She did not read the letters. Not then. She put them back exactly as she had found them, her hands very steady. She went back to her work. That evening, in her narrow room, she lay in the dark and thought about her mother's letters in her mother's handwriting in a drawer that had apparently gone undisturbed for at least 4 years. She thought, "My father kept them there. He kept them close enough to touch." She did not sleep for a long time. The woman who made Ashveil difficult was not the Duke. Lady Rosamond Fitch had arrived the second week of November, announced by a letter, and attended by a maid, 2 trunks, and an air of settled certainty that everything she encountered would eventually arrange itself to her satisfaction. She was 27, darkly handsome, and connected to the Revane family through a complicated route of cousinage that Theodora had established precisely by listening to Mrs. Overton speak to the cook. She was, in short, a candidate. The Duchess Dowager, Calder Ravane's mother, who lived in the dower house half a mile from the main building, and who made her opinions known through a system of notes delivered by a single expressionless footman, was in favor of her. "She's a managing sort," Agnes the parlor maid said, in the kitchen, the second day of Lady Rosamond's visit. "Managing is another word for capable," said Mrs. Overton, without looking up from her accounts. "Managing is another word, for she'll rearrange the furniture and make the rest of us learn where it's gone," said Agnes. Theodora concentrated on her bread. She had observed Lady Rosamond at a careful distance since her arrival. She had noted the way she spoke to the other servants, politely, briskly, with the efficiency of someone who regarded politeness to servants as a practical rather than a moral matter. She had noted the way she spoke to the Duke, easily, familiarly, with the kind of history behind it that came from knowing someone, since they were both young enough to be reckless. She had noted the way the Duke spoke back, carefully, warmly, with something that was not quite distance but was not quite its opposite either. She had catalogued all of this and filed it under "Not my concern." She found the ledger on a Thursday afternoon behind a stack of county maps in the far corner of the library, wrapped in a cloth that had been someone's idea of hiding something without committing to it. She opened it at the kitchen table that evening when Mrs. Overton had gone to bed and Agnes was visiting her cousin in the village, and she sat with a candle and turned the pages with the care of someone who has been waiting 4 years for this specific moment. The accounts were what she had suspected, not falsified. Her uncle was too careful for falsification, but massaged, the way a text can be massaged when you know which sentences to emphasize and which to set in small print. Several years of income from the estate's tenant farms recorded in a column that, if you didn't know the correct market rates for the period, would seem entirely ordinary. A management fee, modest on its face, that compounded across 18 months into a figure that made her jaw tighten. She sat with it for a long time. Then she copied out the relevant figures in her own hand, folded the paper, and put it in her traveling bag behind the false bottom. She had installed up herself 3 years ago in Edinburgh, with a small chisel and a considerable amount of determination. She replaced the ledger exactly where she had found it. The incident with Lady Rosamond happened on a Thursday. Theodora had been carrying a tray of tea things up from the kitchen, a task below her nominal position, but Mrs. Overton was short-handed, and she had not been in a position to refuse. When she came around the corner of the upper corridor and encountered Lady Rosamond coming the other way, Lady Rosamond stopped. She looked at the tray. She looked at Theodora. "You're Selby," she said. "Yes, my lady. I wanted tea sent up at 3:30. It is now. She looked at the watch pinned to her bodice. 4:20. I'm sorry, my lady. The kitchen was understaffed this. I don't require an explanation. I require tea at the time I asked for it. She paused, then added, with the particular precision of someone who understands that cruelty is most effective when it is delivered quietly. If you find the work here too demanding for your capabilities, I'm sure Mrs. Overton can find someone better suited. Theodora looked at her. She looked at her for exactly long enough to be a half-second past the point of servility, not quite long enough to be insolence. She was rather proud of calibrating it so precisely afterward. I will ensure it doesn't happen again, my lady, she said, and continued down the corridor. She did not allow herself to feel anything until she was around the corner and out of sight. Then she stood with her back against the wall and breathed very slowly and thought, 16 months. 14 perhaps, if the court moved promptly. She could do 14 months. She could do anything for 14 months. It was the Duke who found the letters. She did not know this immediately. What she knew immediately was that on the Monday of the 3rd week she was at Ashveil. Mrs. Overton summoned her to the study and told her, with an expression of careful neutrality, that His Grace wished to speak with her. She walked to the study with the same face she had worn into every difficult room for the past 4 years, prepared. Still, a face that did not arrive at its destination before the rest of her. He was standing at the window when she came in. He did not turn at once. When he did, she noticed, because she noticed everything, that he was holding something. A small bundle of papers. You found these, he said. It was not a question. Mrs. Overton must have seen her that evening, or Agnes had come home early. She did not, in that moment, much care which. Yes, Your Grace, in the 3rd drawer of the library writing table. Yes. He looked at her. It was a different kind of looking than he had done that first morning, less cataloguing, more attention. The distinction she found was uncomfortable. They belonged to the late Lady Elliston, he said. Miriam Elliston. She was. He stopped. I knew who she was. My mother and she were acquainted. Theodora felt something move in her chest. She kept her face entirely still. I was not aware they were in the house, he said. I would like to understand how they came to be there. I couldn't say, Your Grace. No, he said. He looked down at the letters in his hand. No, I don't suppose you could. A silence. Outside the window, a crow crossed the gray sky and disappeared behind the larches. You were very careful, he said, putting them back, Your Grace, exactly as you found them. Whoever left them there, left them in a particular order. You kept it. He paused. Most people wouldn't have noticed there was an order to keep. She did not say anything. He looked at her again, with that same quality of attention that she found she could not quite deflect the way she could deflect most things. What is your name? He said. Maud Selby, Your Grace. The pause that followed was not quite like any pause she had experienced before. It was the pause of a man who has looked at something from one angle and then shifted slightly and noticed that the shape of it has changed. Of course, he said finally. Thank you, Selby. That will be all. She sent a letter to Mr. Finn that evening. She told him she had the documentation. She told him she was ready to proceed. She did not tell him that she was frightened, not of the legal proceedings, not of her uncle, not of the months that still remained before the estate could formally revert, but of something smaller and more immediate, which was that the Duke of Ashveil had looked at her twice now, in a way that made her feel as though she were not quite as invisible as she had intended. She needed to be invisible. Everything depended on being invisible. She folded the letter and sealed it and placed it on the Morning Post without allowing herself to think any further about the way he had said. You were very careful. Lady Rosamond left on a Friday. There was no dramatic exit. There was simply a carriage at the front door, and trunks, and the Duchess Dowager's expressionless footman delivering a note that presumably said something, and then Lady Rosamond in her traveling coat, pausing at the top of the front steps. The Duke had come out to see her off. Theodora watched from an upper window, not particularly intending to watch, simply there. She could not hear what was said. She saw Lady Rosamond turn back once and say something, and the Duke answer. She saw the particular quality of the silence between them when he answered. Not cold, not unkind, but final. Final, she thought, in the way of something that has been considered carefully and decided. She went back to her work. It was 3 days after Lady Rosamond's departure that he found her in the stables. She had gone to speak to the head groom about the fence along the east pasture, which had been listed in the estate inventory as repaired, and which, she had established by walking the perimeter on her half-day, had in fact not been repaired, but rather propped in a way that might survive a passing glance in dry weather. She had framed her inquiry as a passing comment, the way she framed most things. She was very skilled by now at framing. The Duke came through the stable door behind her with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who is going somewhere and then stopped because she was there. "Selby," he said. "Your Grace." She stepped to the side to let him pass. He did not pass. "The east pasture fence," he said. She looked at him. "I had the same thought," he said, "last week. I spoke to Hartwell about it. He named the head groom. He confirmed it." A pause. "It was on the inventory as repaired," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. It was not repaired. No, Your Grace." Something shifted in his face. Not the expression. The expression stayed exactly where it was, but something underneath it. "How long have you worked for the Delmarsh household?" he said. 3 years. "Lady Delmarsh is known for her gardens," he said. "Not her fences." She said nothing. "What is your name?" he said. She had answered this question. He knew this. They both knew he knew this. "Maud Selby," she said. He looked at her for a long time. "My solicitor wrote to me last week," he said, "from Edinburgh. He has received notification from a firm in the same city that the beneficiary of this estate is preparing to petition the court to dissolve the current trusteeship arrangement." He paused. "The beneficiary's name is Theodora Elliston." The barn swallows crossed the beams above them. The horses shifted in their stalls. "She would be," he said, "approximately your age." Theodora looked at Calder Ravaine, 5th Duke of Ashveil, who was standing in her stable in front of her horse, and she made a decision. Not the decision she had made in the inn in Inverness, which had been careful and calculated and had taken 3 days. This one took perhaps 3 seconds. "Yes," she said, "she would be." He was not angry. This surprised her. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "How long?" 5 weeks. You've been here 5 weeks. Yes. You've been walking the fences," he said, "reading the library, looking at the accounts." He paused. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Yes." "Your uncle?" "Yes." He moved to the stable door and stood looking out at the drive, his hands behind his back, the particular posture of a man who is thinking rather than just thinking that he is thinking. "I suspected something in the accounts," he said. 18 months ago, I raised a concern with my solicitor. He suggested it was within the ordinary range of estate management." He paused. He was wrong. She had not expected this. "I was wrong to take his word for it," he said. He turned then and looked at her, and it was a different look again. This one had something in it she recognized, because she had looked the same way at herself in the mirror enough times. The look of someone who has been careful and competent and has still been outmaneuvered and is deciding what to do about it. "The letters," he said. "Your mother's letters." "My father kept them in the drawer," she said. "I suppose he liked having them near." He looked at her for a moment, not the cataloging look, not the attention look. Something quieter than either of those. "Yes," he said, "I suppose he did." She wrote to Mr. Fenn the next morning and told him to proceed with the full petition. She wrote a second letter, to her uncle in Glasgow, which contained no threats, because she had not needed threats. It contained only the figures from the ledger and a date by which he was invited to make an accounting to the court. She did not write any letters that addressed the fact that the Duke of Ashveil had, at the end of their conversation in the stable, asked whether she would consider remaining at Ashveil once the trusteeship was dissolved. Not as Maud Selby. As herself, she had looked at him across the cold flagstones, with her hands still carrying the evidence of several weeks of honest labor, and she had thought about the barn swallows and her mother's letters in their careful order, and the way he had said you were very careful in a tone that was not accusation and not admiration but something between them that she did not have a word for. "I had not thought that far ahead," she had said. "Neither had I," he had said, which was, she recognized, entirely honest. The court proceeding took 11 weeks. Her uncle made his accounting and found it short in ways that could be demonstrated conclusively, with reference to the ledger figures and the tenant records that Mr. Fenn had obtained through the county court. He did not contest the dissolution. He was not, in the end, a man who wished to be seen doing something wrong nearly as much as he wished to not be seen doing something wrong, and the distinction had ceased to be available to him. On the morning the dissolution was granted, she drove up the Ashveil Drive in a carriage that belonged to her, and stepped out onto the gravel that was hers and looked at the larch trees that were, in the technical sense of the thing, also hers, and felt something she was not, this time, required to put away. The Duke was waiting at the door, not as the Duke of Ashveil as trustee, not as Calder Ravain of the solicitor's letters, as a man who had, over the 11 weeks of legal proceedings, written 4 letters and asked no questions that she wasn't prepared to answer, and had offered quietly, through Mr. Fenn, to provide a sworn statement to the court regarding the fence inventory discrepancy if it would be useful. It had been useful. She had not said anything to him about it directly. She had not been certain, for most of those 11 weeks, what she would say to him when she did see him directly. She stood on the gravel and looked at him and thought, he has brown eyes. She had known this. She had catalogued it in the stable, the library, the morning of the boot-blacking. She had not, until this moment, felt it as something distinct from information. "Miss Elliston," he said. "Your Grace," she said. A pause in which they both recognized the formality for what it was, a starting point and a slightly absurd one, given everything. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the boots." She looked at him for a moment, and then, for the first time in the 5 months, since she had written Maud Selby in the steam on a mirror in Inverness, she laughed. It came from somewhere that had been closed for a long time, and it surprised her, and apparently it surprised him as well, because something in his face opened like a window that has been stiff and then suddenly isn't. "You didn't know," she said. "That is exactly the sort of excuse," he said carefully, "that I should not be permitted to use." "Perhaps not," she said, "though I did clean them very thoroughly." "You did," he said. "I noticed." She looked at the house, her house, in the stone and the October cold and the larches all gone red at their edges, and she thought about her father, who had kept her mother's letters in a drawer within arm's reach for the rest of his life. She thought about what it meant to keep something close enough to touch. "I think," she said, "you might come in." And he did.